Thanks everybody for coming out on this Friday evening to Indivisible Houston's visit with Jared this evening. My name is Daniel Cohen, I'm our chair. We focus on what we would call advocating for government of, by, and for the people through education, engagement, and resistance. Or if you want something that's more immediately actionable, supporting good policies and killing bad bills whenever they come up. Tonight's event is very, very special to us, and we're just so happy that you're all here this evening, and it's an honor to fight by your side. And I'll be here all night, so feel free to talk to me. I'd like to bring up our action chair, Nisha Randall.
Thank you guys so very much for coming out. I really appreciate it. I remember back in summer when I was really getting involved in the election. And Jared was one of the first people that I followed because he was actually out on the ground following the Trump campaign. Yeah, I realized that he was going to write a book, and so I started kind of Twitter stalking him, and eventually got up the nerve to ask him if he'd like to come out and do a book signing, book reading for us, and he said yes. Jared Yates Sexton is a writer, academic, and political correspondent whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Republic, and Salon, and literary journals around the world. He's a regular guest on television, radio, and podcasts, and the author of 3 collections of short fiction. And the people are going to rise like the waters upon your shore. I'm going to stop rambling, and here's Jared.
I want to have a conversation tonight about politics, but before we do, for those of you who might not know me, I want to give a little bit of background on who I am and where I'm coming from and what's happening with this book. I did not plan on writing this book. This was not one of those situations where I woke up one day and decided to start covering politics because that was my life. I'm a fiction writer. Like, that's my thing. And in 2015, I was writing this novel, and it like ballooned out of control, as novels do. Like, I planned it to be about 300 pages, and I got to page 440 with no end in sight. And it was about this guy who worked for a conspiracy theorist podcaster, much like Alex Jones and Texas's own, right? And it was about this guy who worked for Alex Jones and this guy who, on one hand, peddled these giant, massive conspiracies meant to undermine confidence in government and politics, and on the other hand, sold like male vitality potions, which is, it turns out, a great business model. That guy makes so much money, and it's like, he's like, well, cavemen didn't have impotence. All right, there we go, we're away, we're gonna make millions now. So I was writing this novel, and it was completely out of control, and I decided I needed a hobby to get me away from this novel. So, like any sane, rational person, I decided I was going to start going to political rallies. I thought in 2015 that the 2016 election was going to be boring. I thought, like a lot of people, it was going to be Hillary Clinton versus Jeb Bush. I thought it was going to be the scions of 2 political dynasties fighting for control over the office. And I was like, well, you know what? It might be boring, but I'm going to throw myself in full-bodied and decide, what's happening here. So I went out, and I went out to Iowa, which is weird, leading up to presidential elections. And, I saw Bernie Sanders in like a small, like, union hall where a speaker blew out. And he didn't stop, which is just the most Bernie thing ever. They were in the middle of introducing him, and he didn't wait for the introduction to be done. He just walked out, and he's like, what are we doing? It was wonderful. And then I saw Chris Christie, I saw Hillary Clinton a couple days after she officially announced, although, of course, she'd been running for president for 10 years. And it was all politics as usual, with the exception of Bernie, who seemed like sort of a weird mutant in the process, and I didn't know what that was going to be. And then Donald Trump came along, and I think, like a lot of people, I thought of him like a sideshow, right? I think everyone assumed that Donald Trump was running for president to extend his brand, right? It was the off season between Celebrity Apprentices. God, that sounds so surreal saying that out loud. He had designs on possibly starting his own cable news network. A lot of people expected this to be a flash in the pan, a quick little experiment, right? He was going to maybe go to a debate, and then he'll lose in Iowa, and then he'll drop out, and that'll be the end of it. I still think about the Huffington Post deciding they would not cover him in their political section, right? It was in the entertainment section. I went to my first Trump event in South Carolina. It was Senator Tim Scott's presidential forum. He talked to all the Republican candidates and had interviews with them. And I went to this earlier on, and I started noticing that there was something different about Donald Trump, right? Well, I mean, obviously. But there was something different about him running for president, and that was I did not expect people to take him seriously. And then I got to this event, and I started having these conversations with people. And they would say things to me. They found out that I was a writer, and they gave me a little bit of leeway because I live in Georgia. I'm from Indiana, and you know they have this idea of what a writer would be, right? A New York-based metropolitan person who would swoop in and leave. So they would talk to me, and a couple of guys told me that they didn't think there were more, like, what was it? 10% of the country was liberal. That like only 10% of the United States population was could be considered liberal. And then they started talking about how they didn't know anybody who was a liberal. And they started using this phrase. They were going after this New York reporter, and they told him that he lived in a cloud. Right? I don't know what it's like in your cloud, but you know, this is what life is like out here. And I started to realize something that I think was very obvious if you paid attention, if you watched the news, but nobody really wanted to mention, which was that America had moved into a new phase where the citizenry could live in different realities while living on the same block. And that was one of the first moments that I actually considered the possibility that Donald Trump's candidacy could be something. A little bit of time passed, and then I went to my first Trump rally. And my first Trump rally was December 8th, 2015. It was in South Carolina aboard the USS Yorktown. And this was the night that he announced his proposed ban on all Muslim immigration. And I was very shocked by what I saw in this rally, right? I started to notice not just that people supported him, but that he was developing a base that did not support him like a regular candidate, right? It wasn't that they necessarily agreed with him politically. It was that they associated themselves with him, right? It's the same way, we're in Texas. The Astros just won, right? They're scrappy underdogs. They how many games did they lose a few years ago? It was
111.
111! Not that anybody keeps track, right? So, you know, to be a Houston Astros fan, it says something about you, right? Like, I'm a Chicago Cubs fan. That says something about me, right? I'm fine. I'm masochistic, right? I spent all this time watching baseball, 162 games a year of futility. Just them getting the hell beat out of them, right? And yet, I have like that hope. I keep tuning in and hoping it'll be something. I started realizing that the same way that Americans identify themselves with sports teams or with hobbies or ideas, they were starting to associate themselves with Donald Trump, right? It wasn't about politics. It was, but it wasn't, right? It was about saying something about yourself. Like planting a Trump sign in your front yard says something. It says, I don't care what you think about me. I'm against political correctness. I'm against progressivism. This is who I am. I left that rally concerned, and I walked outside, and I watched this line form outside the rally. On one side, there were a bunch of protesters, most of them college age from around Charleston and the area. And they were outside, they were protesting, they thought that Trump's policies and ideas and rhetoric were racist. And then the Trump supporters formed on the other side. And there was a battle between the two, right? You could feel like a palpable tension of these worlds, those two clouds, right? When they finally meet, it's like two weather fronts meeting, and there's going to be a storm, right? So they were over here chanting about Trump, and the Trump supporters were over here threatening them. They were telling them to kill themselves, that they were going to go back to their trucks and their cars, and they were going to get guns and shoot them. I mean, this was like straight up what they were saying. Then a guy, and remember, this was aboard an aircraft carrier, right? So this was like a park. There was like a giant turret gun. You know the ones where like you shoot at planes that go by? It's like one of those old memorial turret guns. And a guy walked over to me, and he kind of motioned at the turret gun, and he motioned at the protesters, and he said, "I really wish that gun was working right about now." And he basically told me that he wanted to kill all of these protesters. That was like a big moment for me. And that hobby that I had started kind of turned into something else. I realized that there's something deeper going on behind where we are now that not a lot of people, I don't think, wanted to talk about, right? I think a lot of people were in denial about what part of Trump's base was and what they were becoming. He eventually won the nomination, of course, and then in June of 2016, which is probably the only reason why I'm in this room tonight, I went to Greensboro, North Carolina, to a rally, and there was this weird feeling that this group was coalescing around each other. They sort of had an understanding. I called it a safe place in the New York Times. And what it was is you had a group of people who felt safe and secure around each other, saying things that they normally wouldn't feel safe saying in public, right? That veil of political correctness and expectations of society had broken. It started, this was right after the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting. And it started when one of the pre-speakers for Trump said, of course, our hearts and our prayers are with the victims of the Pulse nightclub. And a man a few feet away from me yelled out, "The gays had it coming." And this man looked around for a moment. Like he said it, and I think he surprised himself. You know what I mean? Like he put the words out there, and then he totally expected the consequences, but there weren't any. In fact, people started like clapping him on the back. They started like sort of associating with him, and from there, the other people who were there started doing the same thing, and it got progressively worse and worse and worse to the point where, I mean, racial slurs, misogynistic slurs, left and right, and it sort of became a social thing. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I'm doing this, you're doing this, we're okay with it. Yeah, we're together on this. And I started to realize it was, and I started to realize that this was a thing. Now, I was live tweeting this, but I didn't have very good signal, so I wasn't like checking my phone. And I was just live tweeting this thing. And Chrissy Teigen, who I didn't know who that was. Yeah, John Legend's wife. Apparently, her and John Legend retweeted some stuff. And my reporting went viral in a very weird and scary way. And I got out of there, and I went into the rally with like 1,000 Twitter followers, and I walked out with 80,000. And so that was something. And I walked out of there, and I kind of got dragged kicking and screaming into like a national conversation because, as you might remember, when Trump was gaining momentum, news outlets weren't reporting on the crowds, right? They were very happy to just point a camera at the podium and show his 2-hour-long speeches and all this stuff. And that was exciting, but then something else happened, and I started getting these threats. And I saw your alt-right shirt over here.
Yeah.
I got to know who the alt-right was very quickly. And the alt-right kind of gathered and tried to get me fired from my job. They started calling into my work. They started calling the dean of my college because they don't understand academic freedom. And then another group of people, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, KKK, they started threatening me. And at first, this just felt like, everyone talks about it as being like internet trolling. And it's just the internet. It's no big deal. One night, my partner and I were at home. She was asleep in the living room. It was about 4 a.m. I was working on a new article. Person started circling my house a bunch of times. They kept pulling into my driveway, flashing their lights. They tried to break into our house a couple of times. I started getting letters at work that were, just madness, right? These are just like weird, random cutout articles with things highlighted that are threatening and weird. I started getting phone calls, things like that. And I started to realize that when you picked up this rock that I think a lot of us were looking at for a long time, we didn't know what was underneath it, right? And we can sit here and we can talk about Donald Trump's policies all night, and I assume maybe we will. But the thing that we weren't talking about as a culture was that his candidacy was being used by some really frightening people. And you can talk about whether or not that was by happenstance or design, whether it was a strategy or a happy accident, but it was there, right? And this was the thing that I think it took us a long time to figure out. And I think a lot of people are just coming around to this fact. And sadly, when the tragedy happened at Charlottesville, I know that people who are in the media who have had to deal with this stuff, we kind of were not that surprised, right? This was brewing for a very long time. We have groups of people in the alt-right and the white supremacists who talk openly and constantly about killing people, murdering people. They talk about revolutions. They talk about coups. They talk about killing journalists. They talk about killing citizens. This is a problem, right? This is like a real thing that is going on in this country. And it's not enough to talk about Democrats and Republicans, liberal and conservative. There's a sickness at the heart of this thing. And we have to look at that thing in the face. We have to understand what it is, and everyone has to just reject it, right? This has to be like one of the great uniting things of our time, and we need to understand like what is happening and where it's coming from. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. I did not plan on doing it, but that's why I'm here tonight, and I would love to have conversations with you. I'm going to drink water and pretend to be smart and say smart things. So if anyone has anything they'd like to bring up, I'm more than happy to do it. Yeah?
I'd like one question. I was listening to, I don't remember who the woman was, but she was an anchor for one of the TV networks.
Mm-hmm.
And she was talking about their coverage of Trump. And she seemed completely oblivious to the billions of dollars of free coverage. How did it take somebody who was taking a break from a novel to discover the sickness and that was right there on the floor in front of them?
Well, there were a couple things happening with that. One, at these rallies, and these are big TV shows, right? They're just big stage TV shows, which, we can talk more about this in a little bit, but that's, at its heart, one of the biggest problems is that this has turned into entertainment and right. Mm-hmm. But they would pin up reporters. They would put them behind barricades. And they would just be back there, right? And the reporters were happy to be back there. They had a place to plug in their laptops and charge their phones. The simple truth of it is, they didn't want to know it. And it was so far out there, and it was so far against their own interest at the time. Donald Trump is the best thing that ever happened to cable news. Mm-hmm. And not only was his campaign a thing that made people turn on the TV, it's now an anxiety drug that everybody is hooked on, right? We have to turn it on, we have to watch it because God knows what's happening right now. I was on a flight out here today and the Wi-Fi was down and I got off my plane. I was like, what the hell happened while I was on the plane? That's an addiction. And for the longest time, I really believe, and I'll be frank with you, some of my biggest criticisms are against mainstream media outlets. I think that they own a very large portion of what this country is like today. And for the longest time, they saw this, it was the goose that laid the golden egg. And they didn't want to know it. And you got to think the people who were behind the barricades, who were tweeting and reporting, they watched it. They heard it, right? But it wasn't the story. And when that rock got pulled up, that was the story. And in part, I think it's because they work by narrative, right? The whole narrative was Donald Trump is an embarrassment. He's never going to be president. Oh, Donald Trump is rising in the polls. It won't last that long. Oh, here's another scandal. It'll go away, right? And the whole time, they just relied on the narrative. Because for them, it's a TV show. And I say all the time that right now, the most popular television show in America is America. It's the fall of America, and it's the falling apart of our norms and culture. And they relied on that. And quite frankly, they still rely on that. And I think that is, I think that's like one of the more dangerous things we've got going. Yeah. I just read, real fast, while I've been on tour, Fantasyland. Have y'all heard of this book? It's back there, I just saw it. I can't remember the name of the author, but he makes this incredible argument.
Kurt Anderson.
What's that?
Kurt Anderson.
Kurt Anderson. It is so unbelievable. He makes this argument that America has disappeared into its own fantasy, right? Like, we've lost the ability to know the difference between what's real and what's narrative. And I think that's what's at the heart of all of this. And I think that once you get pulled into it, and I know I did, when I started getting a little bit of traction, and I started going on TV, I started talking to other pundits, all this stuff, I believed it too. Because it's so easy, right? It's a different world. It's a different reality. And I was surprised on Election Day. I should not have been. And it was because you get dragged into that world. I'm sorry, you had your hand, right?
Oh, I was just thinking about the comments that Lessman, who's the chairman and CEO of CBS, made a year and a half ago. He's not. He's maybe not good for America, but he sure is good for CBS.
Well, and the sad truth of it is that I think people have lost the ability to know the difference between the two. And this goes back to, and again, I apologize for the sports metaphor, but quite frankly, one of the things we're watching now is the sportsification of politics, right? Like, you turn on cable news now, it's who won. And we treat every situation as if it's a game. So I'm sure we'll talk more about Roy Moore after a while, but but I don't like that there is a politician who we should all understand, Democrat and Republican, that this is a repugnant human being who should not serve.
Right.
I don't want to turn on the radio and hear how it's good for Democrats. I don't want to turn on the radio and hear how liberals won today.
Right.
It's about, like, shared society. And the fact that we treat it like it's a scoreboard. And quite frankly, I'm guilty of it. I think we all are, right? At our worst moments, we are. We should be concerned with making the country better instead of lining our pockets, instead of doing this kind of stuff. And everything right now incentivizes division. I mean, quite frankly, and not to get too far in the weeds here, if I left here tonight and I wanted to, like, I don't know, get more Twitter followers, gain more notoriety, get a larger platform, all I got to do is leave this bookstore and say a bunch of really crazy, off-the-wall, far-left stuff. Do you know what I mean? Like, you just push the envelope as far as you can, and people want it, because that's what feeds the addiction that we've currently got going. And that's what feeds that. I'm sorry, but if a person stands up and says it's good for a network, it's not good for a country, That's shameful.
Right.
That bothers me so much. Yeah.
Yeah, I kept thinking all along, I felt like he was a dangerous man early on in the process, quite frankly. I'm a student of history. I just look at despots from way back and what their methodology was. And every time I heard the media, making a big deal out of him and it, if you will, because it was good for their ratings,
Mhm.
I kept thinking to myself this very old joke about, I don't belong to the Klan, I just sell them their sheets. And I felt
I've never
like
heard that.
the networks were selling the sheets.
Wow.
Well, by the way, I've been thinking this whole time how I'm going to get this water bottle and not look like Marco Rubio. All I wanted in the world was this water bottle.
That the media, that the big networks were complicit
Well,
in doing something that was dangerous for the country,
So
or putting a dangerous man there.
So we're really bad. You brought up history, and this is something in America, unfortunately, we're really bad at.
Right.
Americans are good at a lot of things. We're incredibly bad at putting things into context. We especially now with the accelerated news cycle that we have, we're really bad at it. Journalism, at its heart, and people say all the time, journalism used to be objective. No, it didn't. Journalism started as partisan publications, right? So we're back there. We're right back around, right? But at its heart, the partisan media that we used to have was about making the country better, right? People did it because they thought it was going to help the union. They thought it was going to help citizens live better lives.
That's about selling soap.
Now, well, and
or whatever.
Think about this. We don't have to get too deep into capitalism, but we can talk about this. Every network either profits or they stagnate, right?
Mm-hmm.
They only do well in times of crisis. They only do well in times of uncertainty and chaos. That means that every single network, it doesn't matter if it's Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, they only do better when things are unstable.
Mm-hmm.
And that idea has been in place for as long as, well, CNN started out being the most boring network available, right? You turned it on and it anchors like today, da-da-da-da-da-da. Then we got into punditry. Then all of a sudden we end up with shouting heads the same way ESPN has. And that's what people want, right? It used to be about common good. And now it's about profit. It absolutely is. Yeah.
It used to be also about factual reporting. If you think back before news was a profit center for a broadcast company, news was a separate entity. They were not part of the ratings war.
Yeah.
Walter Cronkite
Right.
and Brinkley, when they got on TV, it was reporting the facts. They didn't give their opinion, they didn't give it a spin, and they weren't worried about keeping it exciting for the ratings. And that's where I think we really dropped the ball here. It should be a whole separate entity.
So Cronkite and Edward Murrow, who I think are the, they are the idols of what media should be, right? They were not technically objective, right? They were, but they weren't. There's a quote that I think is incredibly important now more than ever, and it was Howard Zinn who wrote A People's History, and he said, you can't remain neutral on a speeding train, right? There's no way that you possibly can. The way that Cronkite reported on the Vietnam War, the way that Edward Murrow reported on McCarthy, there was a political viewpoint, right?
Yeah.
But it was all based on the idea that I recognize that there's a problem. I recognize that there's a sickness. And those are the times when editorial comes into it, right? So one of my problems right now, and I've been screaming this from the rooftop for months now, we're facing in a lot of different ways an existential threat in this country. Like we're at a crossroads in a lot of different ways. And I'll tell you what makes me sick. What makes me sick is turning on the news and watching people dance around it, right? I call it the cliffhanger, right? We have these people who, they get on, they'll have a conversation. So like let's say after the shooting the other day, right? We'll have, yeah, which one? No kidding. So they'll get on there and they'll say, you're going to yell, and then right after it's over, they say, well, we'll continue this conversation in the days to come. And it just, that's it. right? And the reason they do that is just to push it forward. That's about narrative, and that's not about reporting the news. Reporting the news is giving facts to people and letting people extrapolate ideas behind it, right? If there's a fire down the street, you report that there's a fire so people can make a decision not to go to the fire or know that their loved ones are in danger. There's a fire right now, and this dramatization of this situation is really, really disgusting, I think. And I'm with you. I think that we need a big conversation about objective and subjective and journalism and understanding what they are, because I don't think this country understands it.
They don't.
Yeah.
They don't.
Yeah.
Talking about the media, could you maybe kind of contrast the way that the media covered Trump as a circus to an extent, but then flat out almost refused to cover Bernie almost at all?
Well, so again, so the first time I ever saw Bernie Sanders, it was in this UAW hall in this small little Iowa town, and at that point he was gaining momentum. Like, they couldn't put down enough chairs. Like, they were going into the next building over to bring in chairs because, quite frankly, Bernie was a shot in the arm, right? We were talking right before this thing. Bernie had no artifice whatsoever. He was a rumpled older man who was not interested in stagecraft, right? So they start announcing Bernie, and this UAW guy gets up and he's like, well, I know you're here to see Senator Sanders, and Senator Sanders is da-da-da-da. And Bernie just comes out. And Bernie comes up and he grabs the podium like it's going to leave him. Right? Like somebody's going to take him away. He was everything that every other candidate was not. Right? Now, we don't have to get into the politics of Hillary Clinton right now, but let's talk about the stagecraft of Hillary Clinton, right? I went to this UAW hall where Bernie Sanders comes in during an introduction. As he is yelling, the speaker goes out and he just lifts his tone up, right? The next day, I go to, it was the Iowa State Fairgrounds, and I go to the Hillary Clinton campaign. It was the slickest presentation I've ever seen, right? It was like it was like a conveyor belt of volunteers who would get you here, another person would get you here, then down here, and it was just like, what are you excited about today? We'll make sure that when you get inside, you talk about what you're excited about, right? That's the type of politics that people are tired of, right? It's that presentation, it's that stagecraft. The reason that Bernie Sanders didn't get the media attention is because he didn't make good TV. I think eventually they had to talk about him because, it turned into a horse race between him and Clinton. But in the very beginning, it was the lack of stagecraft. And he wouldn't do the thing that Trump did. Trump would always start a new scandal, right? And the new scandal would own the news cycle for another 48, 72 hours. Sanders just got out and talked about stuff, and then he left, right? There's a big difference between that. And one of them makes good TV, and the other one doesn't. And so I think that that's where that happened. I think that that's where the divide happened. Because I guarantee that if Sanders would have had more fireworks and pizzazz, oh my God, they would have given him tons of free time. But that's not who he is. He's a rumpled Vermont senator, right? And that's actually, I think, why he appealed to people.
Just
Yeah.
I guess maybe a small anecdote there. I have a friend that worked on Hillary's advance team, and one of the things he posted on Facebook was him on a ladder vacuuming a flag out, and one huge, dozen by 2 dozen feet flag to make it just perfect for the backdrop. And to contrast that, I got to meet Bernie when he came to Houston, and I took a picture, and it's, the one politician I've ever met that I truly was happy to meet, frankly. And he looks like Woody Allen's drunk uncle. Like, his hair is tousled, he looks like he's been drinking, and, he just...
One of my favorite things about him are all of the pictures of him on commercial aircrafts in coach.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's one of my, and that was during the campaign. Now, that's a difference, right? And there's a reason behind it. And by the way, again, we can talk about Hillary Clinton's politics all day, but the simple truth was Hillary Clinton was not ready for a 2016 campaign, right? I said this the other day and it finally clicked in my head. The American Revolution, right? So the reason why America won the Revolution is because the redcoats were fighting an old kind of war. Mm-hmm. They lined up, right? Which is just madness if you think about it. They lined up and they were like, well, I'm going to get shot. Yeah. And then the revolutionaries were like, no, I'm going to run to the woods and then I'll attack you from over here. It was an old style of political warfare that they weren't aware had changed. And I think that's a big reason why we saw what happened happen. Yeah. Yeah.
So, as a journalist, do you have any ideas or feelings about how journalists outside the United States, in Canada, Europe, Australia, view what's going on here?
I will tell you this. The world is fascinated by us. My media requests, I mean, 5 to 1 are from foreign outlets, right? They just want to talk about it because they want to understand. America has always been a weird little ant farm for them, right? Like, we're over here, we're cowboys, we do our thing. They look at this as, it's like if you had a friend who had a problem. You know what I mean? And you watch them sort of spiral out of control. Like they have like a dependency problem or they're erratic or something. But then there's something else going on. Almost every major civilized country right now is having their own erosion of norms and ideas, right? I mean, of course we have Brexit, right? Germany had their elections. There was an attempt to hack their elections. We see far-right authoritarian fascist groups rising in every major industrial nation. They have started to see that. And America was the canary in the coal mine, right? They were like, if that could happen in America, it can happen anywhere. And they are currently very concerned about that. And I think that their press is talking about sociology and psychology a lot more than our press is. They're very interested in examination. Their segments on TV are a lot longer and a lot more nuanced because they want to talk, they're not bringing screaming talking heads on. They're bringing professors, academics, and scientists, right? They want to know like what's happening here before it happens. And that gives me hope, but it also scares me, of course, because we haven't done that at all. Yeah.
Do you think that self-reflection, like from a media narrative perspective, as a combined culture, like, how do you shovel water out of the ship that's kind of like sinking, right?
How do you make people eat their vegetables, right?
Fry it.
You know what I think that's a great question. And here's what, I got real low. Okay. Here's what I think is going on. I think that the media has severely underestimated the American people. I think that they have conversations all the time that are like, man, I really want to do a story on this, or I really want to talk about this, or I really want to educate people on this. And they're like, well, how are you going to make them stay on the dial, right? I think our outlets are showing right now that if you give people in-depth reporting that has sources that are well written and compelling, people will consume it, right? I mean, what was it? Like 5 years ago, everyone was saying that print journalism was dead. It's the biggest thing in the world now, right? It's the biggest industry we've got. People want it, and people are desperate for it. And quite frankly, at the heart of this thing, and again, we can talk about motivations of Trump voters. For instance, my family, I come from rural Indiana. My family are factory workers, miners, prison guards, laborers, right? There was what was the word, economic anxiety, that term bandied around, which is just such an oversimplification that could only come from New York City, right? They've been ignored, right? And I don't know how many of you have kids, but if you ignore a kid, they can throw a tantrum. Do you know what I mean? Like if you're not paying attention to a child who wants attention, the child will scream and yell. Donald Trump is that tantrum. And there is a lot of stuff underneath it. There's latent racism. There's There's authoritarian views that, quite frankly, really frighten me when I go home for Thanksgiving. But they will react to it, right? We need a media that goes in and talks about opioid crisis. We need people who go in and talk about the lack of funding in education. We need large, in-depth reporting about like the real problems that are affecting people and not the bullshit that people in Washington are doing, right? That soap opera, Netflix series stuff. And I think if they give it to people, if they actually give them a choice, they'll take it. But I don't think they trust them. I don't think they trust people. Yeah.
Two questions.
Yeah.
Really brief. The first one is if you could provide an example of the kind of reporting that maybe looks a little bit more modern or something that sticks out to you that's interesting.
Yeah.
And the second one is you mentioned earlier sort of that we need to find a way for the country to come together. This is something that's a really common sort of refrain in the circles that we're in because we're in an activist circle. Well, Indivisible is the organization of no. Right, I mean, that's what it came from. There were editorials that came out after the election when people were crying into their beer that said things along the lines of, give us Merrick Garland or go die in a fire.
Yep.
And we were pretty exhausted with constantly compromising because we would go 10 steps and they would walk 10 steps back. And I think people finally just got absolutely fed up. So what would you say to like progressive activists who finally dug in their heels, like balled up their fists and swung back at this point, if we're telling them to give?
Yeah, I don't agree with that. There's a couple of different things happening in that second one. First things first, the New York Times, Washington Post are in a golden age of journalism. They just are. That doesn't mean they get it right all the time. That doesn't, and their editorial pages are hot messes right now. They're really disappointing. But this is also not the time for a purity test when it comes to journalism. Like if they're going to go out and they're going to find the big story, I'm all for that. And I think they've done tremendous work. Actually, you want to say what you want to say about Roy Moore, and again, we can talk about that, and I'll go take a shower. But that story that they reported was meticulous. There were 34 sources. That's incredible. You go to press with three. With 3 sources, you go to press. They had 34 sources, and that is just. I mean, there's a reason there wasn't a lawsuit filed today, right? They nailed it. They got it. Right? As far as coming together, I think that we're wrong about what's happening in this country. And here's the reason why. I think that we have been trained to think about everything as Democrat versus Republican. It's not. We're not two parties anymore, right? What's actually happening is we're 2 groups of people at this point. One group is a lot smaller than the other group, but they are a lot louder and they go vote. One group is, I call them shared society, right? These are people who are interested in sharing a society. These are people who understand we live in a town, we live in a state, we live in a country. We don't always have to agree, right? We can disagree on taxes, we can disagree on trade, we can disagree on wars. I mean, my God, like the amount of Republicans who have come out against Trumpism is one of the more heartening things that I've seen, right? This is Democrat and Republican, actually. I think that umbrella covers it. The other side, the other part, and this is roughly, I'd say probably 35% of the country, are a group of people who don't believe in shared society. They're not interested in compromising the word, actually. And I think compromise gets thrown around all the time because it's a very simple word. I think it oversimplifies what we're talking about, right? Like, I think about Mitt Romney a lot, right? A little clap, that's great. I think about Mitt Romney in 2012. I'm glad Mitt Romney didn't win. But we would not be in the situation we are right now if Mitt Romney had won in 2012. We would be disagreeing on percentage of tax cuts and corporate tax rates, right? Probably we'd be in the streets about that. This is not that, right? This is whether or not we believe in the Constitution. This is whether or not we believe in shared society. This is whether or not we believe, I think a lot about the philosopher Rousseau. Rousseau had this idea called the social contract. And the social contract said that the government is supposed to represent the people, and if they represent us, we'll give them a little bit of our freedom, right, in order for them to represent us. They don't believe in that, right? When Trump gets up and he talks about, why don't they let me tell the Department of Justice what to do? When General Kelly gets up and says, that the greatest of our citizens are soldiers and you have no right to question them, that's not what we are, right? That's a fascistic statement.
Right.
And there are a group of people who do not believe in shared society. And I think that we keep forgetting that, right? We're talking about Democrats and Republicans. That's not what's going on, right? We've seen the Democratic Party have their back broken by Donald Trump. They're terrified of him and his base. Because quite frankly, if they lose Donald Trump's base, they don't win elections anymore, right? That's part of their coalition that they have to win an election. But that's not the fight that we have. The fight is returning norms and returning to a shared idea. And I don't know how we get there, but I don't think it's compromise. I think compromise is not a euphemism. I think it's like a very dangerous term. We can't compromise on society. Like if we compromise on society, like where does that leave us?
It's like compromising on slavery.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, that whole
part of the
thing.
discussion
What
that
was it?
occurred too.
What was it? It was Kelly who said that I wish we could have had a compromise
We
on the
could have
Civil War.
compromised, we could have avoided the Civil War.
That doesn't jive with me.
That's not true.
That doesn't work. Yeah. Yeah.
So, do you feel like you can talk some more about this 35%? Because I'm wondering if they're mostly people who've been left out and forgotten, or if they're these really evil, character disordered people, or do they turn into those people? Where do those?
Can we get deep in the weeds? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Is this a friendly crowd? Okay.
Because I want to know if we should be thinking and behaving differently in regard to those people left behind,
Yeah.
and open our minds more. But if they're the same people who are trying to kill us, I'm not sure.
There's a difference there too. So that 35% that we're talking about, there's a couple of different parties inside of that. And here's what's happening. So my family is part of that, right? My family, again, this is a working class family. My family is racist. My family is patriarchal and misogynistic. My family has authoritarian strains in them. Like after 9/11, these are the type of people who are talking about dropping every single bomb on the Middle East and killing men, women, and children, right? If we're going to be frank, what's happening at the heart with people like that, it's a lack of education. I come from a school that is constantly, I come from a town of about 3,000 people. Linton, Indiana. It's about 3,000 people. They don't get money. They don't get taught civics. They don't really get taught history, right? They're just strained. They don't know what a country is supposed to look like. These are the people who, when they hear, what was it Trump was flirting? He was talking about like, well, maybe we'll have an election in 2020. Remember that? He was like, maybe we will. These are the people who are like, man, I hate politics. If we don't have an election, that's fine. That's ignorance.
But it's
Right.
also economic, because
Right,
they
it
don't
is.
have intellectualism rewarded by any financial,
Well, and they have a spoiled grape system. So for instance, right now we have an urban and rural divide, right? And I'm going to tell you the truth about this, and not a lot of people will come out and say this. They're jealous. They really, really want the things that urban people have. So in my town, I was shocked by this, and I think this is important. In my town, there was a really bougie coffee shop that opened, right? Like, it's called Francisco de Borgia. And this isn't like a farming town in Linton, Indiana. And here's the thing. It's owned by the first two openly homosexual citizens in the town. And by the way, this isn't like a Starbucks knockoff. This is espresso, like you go in and it's like Spanish guitar playing. I told my friends, I said, there's no way that thing stays open. They go. They love it. They love going in of the morning and getting their coffee in there. They like the perks. But guess what? If they are not allowed to have those perks, why would they want them? Sour grapes, right? So you have people who say, well, college education is for snobs. You know why they say that? They can't afford college education. That's like I'm sitting here talking to you right now. I can tell you the amount of money that I owe for college. It's $70,000. Now, I had to do that, and I took it on myself, right? Not everybody in my hometown's going to do that. And they might look at that amount of money that they have to put into it, and they say, screw that. I don't want a college education, right? And so they have sour grapes. But here's the problem. This goes back to what I was saying about like the alt-right and the white supremacist. those people know how to play those people. They are so, Stephen Bannon is the guy who,
Right.
I get pissed off at him every single day because he knows exactly what keys to press with these people. So I have a brother-in-law, and I love him very, very much. I'll never forget this. The day after Obama was elected, he put a meme out on Facebook that said, "Attention, all whites report to the cotton fields." Then he started posting these memes on Facebook. And these memes got progressively worse and worse. I started looking at them. They came from disguised white supremacist sites, right? The KKK, the neo-Nazis, their ranks are growing like crazy because what they're doing is they know what terrible instincts to play on in my family. And my family has all of that frustration and all of that anger, and they are being won over left and right because we need to have a conversation in this country about privilege, right? We need to talk about like what it means to be a white person in this country and what inherent privilege it brings. Try telling my family that. They don't see it. They don't understand the difference between individual and systematic privilege, right? Because they've been oppressed too economically. So then, when those things come together and they're not, they can be completely manipulated by people like Stephen Bannon and the white supremacist. And so now, they're in that 35%. The only thing I can say is we have to do a better job talking to them about how they got there, right? We have to do a better job of letting them know, like, so for instance, you know why they like Trump? He says he's going to bring the factory jobs back. Well, guess what? Those factory jobs are terrible. My family loses their fingers in the factory. My stepfather can barely get out of bed in the morning. My mom was forced into an early retirement because she came down with COPD because of her job, right? They chewed her up and they spit her out. But they still want the job. You know what I mean? And so that manipulation is incredibly potent. And I think the faster that we can sort of untie that knot, I think the better. By the way, how much time do we have?
Maybe like 10
more minutes?
Yeah.
I talk way too much. Okay,
Okay.
here and then
It's
I'll
all
come
good.
back.
It's all
Yeah.
good.
I got a quick question because
Yeah.
I think what you said, there's something that you said that was important when we're referring to your own family, right? That is your family. Have you ever tried to talk to your family? Because if it is that you can't get to your family, what does it say for the others that are trying to talk to people otherwise?
Okay, can I give a piece of bad news?
Yes.
Okay. I'll do it. I am the only thing that is keeping my family from like going full bore into that.
Okay.
So,
That's a
for
good answer.
instance, the amount of times that I've thought about like unfriending my brother-in-law, the amount of times I've thought about unfriending my family, the amount of times that they've said something offensive and I've wanted to walk out of the room, I've lost count. But I'm the one person in the room who says something. And when I say something, it sticks with them, right?
Okay.
Because there's this thing called confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is this amazing thing with cognitive dissonance that basically says, how could anyone disagree with me? They have to be evil,
Right.
right? So that doesn't work, though, when families and friends talk to each other. Because when I'm home, they know who I am. They've known me for 36 years. They love me. If I stand up to them and tell them they're wrong, they may not agree with me, but they know I'm not evil, right? So there's a moment then when they look at the rest of the world, they see it through that lens.
Right.
And whenever they hear
That
another
is-
argument, they think, well, Jared might think that. So that doesn't mean that those people are engaged in a conspiracy. That doesn't mean that these people are evil. Now here's the problem. That shouldn't be our job.
Right.
Right? Like, I can't sit here and tell you that you have to sit there and take your family's shit.
Right.
Right? But if you can, it's incredibly important. These echo chambers and these bubbles, they are the fuel. They're the kerosene being thrown on the fire.
Not to take up too much, but
Yeah.
I'm glad that you said it that way because I also tell I'm from Kingwood, and I tell the white people in Kingwood that they have a whole lot of work to do to help out in the problems that we're having because there are certain things that I can't get across just because of my being that they can.
Yeah.
And that's the reason I acted in the framework
So
that I acted for you.
I'm really Well, I mean, I'm a white man in America, so I'm lucky. But I will say that I am lucky that I can use my privilege in
Right.
that way. So, like, for instance, I wouldn't have been able to go in those Trump rallies if I wasn't who I was.
Right.
You know, it's like I can wander into a Trump rally tomorrow and I just hang out. Right, my glasses are a little
Yeah.
different, but you know, it was a thing where like those are my people. I throw on a flannel that I would usually wear on a Wednesday, and I go hang out. You know,
Yeah.
and by the way, I've heard all the things that they say, so it doesn't shock me. I'm not like, oh my god, right?
Yeah.
I can also use my privilege in a way where I can talk to the people that other people can't.
Right. Exactly.
So like, you know, not to get too real, but if you were to go talk to my family, there would be inherent mistrust.
Right.
Right. That means that that's my job. I think a lot about Michelle Obama. And everybody takes that one quote, which is when they go low, we go high. That quote is really powerful for a lot of different reasons. It has a lot of different contexts. The truth is, when it comes to those people, we're talking about like people who have like bad prejudices that can be manipulated. The sad truth of it is, we have to be bigger people, right? We can't war with them, because the more that we war with them, the farther they go, right? When we ostracize them from society, they go straight to the white supremacist and their ranks balloon, right? So I do what I can, and I take a lot of breaks, right? Like, I'm going home for Christmas, and we'll see what happens. And you know, it is what it is. I saw your hand, I think that's last one.
Along these lines, I've got some of your family background, upstate New York folks, I was raised in Ohio, but I've also got a side of evangelical Christian, really like fundamentalist.
Me too.
So actually, I am considered evil by some people in my family, and I do have to block a couple of them periodically. So, but my concern is, where does that fit into it? Because I think these are hard conversations for me to have with people that are Bible literalists. Like stories, teaching good and bad and rights and wrongs, and not taking them so literally. I mean, I grew up on it, saw it split my family apart, where my mother went one way and my brother, my dad, and I literally went another way. And in the end, as we've tried to come back together, I'm starting to realize now how much of the information they receive is actually from these Nazi organizations. I lived in Washington State for a while, and I had my mother forward me some crazy site the other day. It's Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Well, when the Nazi Party wanted to march, and this is in the 90s that I lived there, they marched in the streets of Coeur d'Alene. I wouldn't have even known that there were still Nazis in the 1990s if I hadn't happened to have been out there for work for 4 years.
I think it's really important. Something you said in there really stuck with me, because I think that it's very telling. You notice when you said that there were a lot of things that happened, and then one person in your family went one way, and another person went another.
Yeah, we literally split.
That sounds like a war.
Yeah.
What happened in this country with the culture wars, it was a real war. And so what has actually happened is because with the 1980s and the 1990s, when evangelical right and the liberal left were fighting constantly, there was a lot of mistrust and a lot of frustration that built there, right? So for instance, right now, in order to be an evangelical in America, church attendance is down. The number of believers is down. They do feel like the circle is closing in on them, right? So when they talk about wanting their country back, they mean it, right? When they talk about like, well, you don't say, the war on Christmas. They literally feel like it is.
Oh, I know.
And when that happens, so what happens is the closer that circle comes in, the more concessions they're willing to make, right? It's like in these war-torn countries where two groups that aren't really related start partnering together in order to achieve political gains. There's a reason why they're all for this guy who's been married 3 times, who is all about opulent housing, and that's a weird way to put it. You know, who's considered himself a playboy and openly and doing all these things. He's against everything they talk about. Now they're out there talking about Roy Moore, and they're like, well, it's like Mary and Joseph. And, oh, I know. And what's happening, though, is it's that rationalization. Their circle is getting smaller, and as long as they can grow the circle a little bit, they'll make concessions. How you make that up, or how you fix it, that's a hard worldview to get into.
Yeah, especially when you start talking the apocalypse, because it's almost like.
You're talking my language.
We're gonna be my mother this afternoon. I go to the, we spend some time together, and by the end of the day, we're talking about how, we're in the times of revelations, and here we go.
Well, so real fast, I will point out, this goes along with what the alt-right and white supremacists are doing. They're using that language to get these people in. So for instance, I listen to Alex Jones, because quite frankly, you have to. You have to.
Yeah.
It's the news. Well, by the way, I do it so you don't have to.
Oh, yeah.
But, so, you'll notice, and by the way, him and Bannon are like that.
Right.
Yes.
So what they do now is, the reason that they get all these people coming in, they speak the language of my family. My family talks about the New World Order, they talk about the apocalypse, they talk about Satan, they bring all this stuff in. They're playing them like an instrument.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening there. I saw a hand just real fast.
So this actually is gonna need to be our closing question.
Okay, yes.
But speaking of Thanksgiving and family, has your family read your book yet?
They bought a copy. Well, so I'm a big weirdo in my family. Like, they come around and like, they have no idea, like, what it is I'm doing. They'll be like, oh, it's the professor. And it's like, yep. Right? They love me,
But you're an anomaly.
but I'm a weirdo. So like, for instance, after these Trump supporters started threatening my life, I went home to visit and they had Trump stuff all over the place. And I was just like, they like threatened my life, right? And they're like, oh, that's fake news. I was like, it wasn't fake news at 4 a.m. They haven't read it yet, but they know what I'm doing out in the world. And here's the good thing about it. They love me and they accept it. They're not going to turn their backs on me, but they do it. And by the way, there's a lot of ostracization out there, right?
Yeah.
Obviously. That's going away. The idea of the family being the center of the country is gone. I mean, now we make our own family, right? Like, we're a family in here right now, and we're in here because we know each other and we're comfortable with each other. The more that the internet and social media has come into play, the less that family thing matters.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of those places, and God help me, I never thought in 2017 I'd be sitting among liberals talking about this. We need to strengthen the family ties. And we need to remind each other about shared society and shared goals. Like, they can do their thing, but these people over here, that's not family. Those are people who are trying to come between family. And I think in a lot of ways there are people out there who are going to hear that and recognize it, and they're going to have those old words and that old language, and I think it'll help. Yeah. Thank you so much.